So the song you were just hearing there is Montini, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, My Homeland. It is an Arab nationalist song. It is actually the current national anthem of Iraq, which was made that in 2004, but it's also was associated with Palestinian Arabs since the 1930s. But before I talk about the Palestinian Arabs, I wanted to talk a little bit about this. You saw me put this up a second ago. Let me go back one. So what I ended on was, in the last video, was Egypt signs a deal with Israel. And that ultimately led to the resolution over the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt recognized Israel. This made a lot of other Arab peoples very angry. Egypt was actually kicked out of an organization called the Arab League for a while because of that. And it led to the assassination of this man, who was the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat. He made this deal with Israel. Here's the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States, again, Jimmy Carter, in 1979. And in 1981, this happened. An Islamist group in Egypt who had used Anwar Sadat's deal to gain some popularity among people who were very angry about the deal, carried out an assassination. And that's what you see happen here. I remember this. I watched seeing this on the news in 1981. So you see here the assassins who were dressed up, who were military officials, and they were within there was a military parade, and they jumped out of their cars and attacked the place where Sadat was. You can see he's probably under those chairs there. They had grenades, and Sadat and about 10 other people were killed. Now, most of these people were captured or killed themselves, and there was a coup that was not successful either. But it did show you were going to see this rift develop even more in the Arab world between different groups, and making a deal with Israel and or the United States could be a bad thing for you if you had enough people in your country who didn't like it. Now let's talk about the Palestinian Arabs. Again, this is a pretty general video. This is a very sensitive topic to many people because it's still a very fresh one to people. There are still big issues surrounding the division of Palestine after 1948. And we've talked about some of that already. And there still is an Israel, and there still is a Palestine that's recognized. Palestine is recognized by most countries of the United Nations as a separate country. So it's still a very sensitive, complex, and issue that drives a lot of emotion on both sides, okay, and on different sides. So just so you understand what I'm talking about. Some of the history. A lot of this is from the Palestinian perspective here, okay? In their minds, they lost their land to Israel. And in their minds, that's true. And I'd say objectively, that's true to some extent, okay? I'm trying to be in the middle and objective on both sides. Okay, that's a difficult thing to do for anybody on any issue, but just trying to give you that position. From the Palestinian perspective, a lot of what becomes Israel, and some of them would say all of what became Israel, was stolen from them, okay? After the war, as we saw on the map, the first war in 48-49, you had Gaza and the West Bank formed. Eventually, because of other wars, Gaza and the West Bank become controlled by Israel, okay? And so Israel has to deal with these areas that have large groups of Palestinian Arabs in them. A lot of Palestinian Arabs over time go to other places during the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Some of them left completely. They go to Europe or the United States or other places. Some of them went to North Africa or Lebanon or Jordan, which was right across the Jordan River there. The man you see in the picture was very significant. He led an organization called the PLO. The PLO, you see the letters there. PLO stands for Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they were an organization that decided in the late 1960s that they wanted to destroy Israel. And from their perspective, they saw Israel and the Jewish Yishuv that had established Israel as the interlopers and who had stolen their land. So they would not officially recognize Israel or its right to exist. And their goal was to defeat Israel and, in their minds, retake all this land, just so you understand. And they did carry out attacks on Israelis, terrorist attacks. They carried out hijacking of planes. And there was a lot of people using Lebanon as a base, Lebanon and Jordan as bases to attack Israel. Jordan got tired of it and basically arrested a bunch of them and drove them out. So a lot of them went to Lebanon. So Yasser Arafat and other of these leaders of this group were in Lebanon, and Lebanon's very close to Israel, it's north of Israel, used it as a staging point to attack Israel in different ways. There was a war that started in Lebanon for other reasons. Lebanon was one of the sad places in the Middle East in the late 70s and early 80s. The war there, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was there, and so Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978 and stayed there, I think, until 1982 or 83. And this was a bad war situation. Now, Israel had superior conventional military. There's no doubt about that. And from the Palestinian and Arab perspective, they see the bombing of planes and other things, tanks, and as much terrorism as anything they did. Okay? Again, I'm just trying to give you different perspectives. This is a famous picture of Arafat, who came and spoke at the United Nations in 1974. So this happened before a lot of the 78 events, in which he famously, he put the argument, interestingly, within the context of the end of colonialism and Western imperialism after World War II. And he said, we're just like any other native liberation movement, whether it was African or Asian. We were colonized by these people who came from another place, right? And we want our things back just like them, just like all these other groups. So whether it was Indians or different places in Africa, etc. Okay, so he tried to put it within that context. Now, throughout the 80s, there was continued conflict, but there was an uprising in 1980s. Intifada was known as uprisings. There were occasional uprisings, and there were really waves of Intifada uprisings by Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza against Israel in the late 80s and early 90s. Okay. Now, the other thing that happened during the late 80s and early 90s was developments within the Palestinian side. There were other movements that arose with different leaders. Some of them were more Islamist. That's another thing to note. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was more secular, nationalist Arabs. They had people from most of them were Muslims, but there were also Orthodox Christians in the group. And so they were not, generally speaking, like an Al-Qaeda type group or even another type of Shia-inspired religious group, okay? They had people from different Muslim groups, too, and different Christian groups. Their focus was Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. That begins to change in the 90s. Iran is going to support certain groups. Hezbollah is one of the main ones. You might have heard of them before. So they developed during this time. And so it gets a little bit more complicated. Now, the PLO did negotiate with Israel in the late 80s and mid-90s. And there were agreements made in, the big agreement was in 1995. Ultimately, of course, it has not settled the issue, as it were. And there continue to be issues between the sides. And that continued even into the late 90s and early 2000s. So I'm going to move to another topic, but I kind of gave you the basics there. Now, you might have heard of these places before, too. I think I showed you this map before, but So this is showing you when oil discoveries first hit most of these places. If you don't know, of course, oil is a big deal in the Middle East and has been, particularly since after World War II. Okay, and they always, the oil situation and the energy situation has played a big role in world politics, particularly since the 1960s, and still does, as you know, right, or should know. And the issues with Israel and others play a role in that too. The one I'm going to talk about right now is the big one, Saudi Arabia, right here. Okay. So we talked a little bit about Saudi Arabia before. Remember, the Saudis were led by Saudi Arabia was founded by Ibn Saud, and it's a monarchy. Now, Britain developed a relationship with them in the 30s. The United States develops a close relationship with the Saudi government, particularly starting during World War II and really afterwards. One of the last things Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in his old age, when he was dying in 1945, was meet Ibn Saud on a ship and discuss American interest in Arabia. Because everybody knew that Arabia had a lot of oil to discover, and this was about getting big American companies involved in doing that there, which they did. So during the 1950s and 1960s, you have this explosion of the petroleum oil industry in Saudi Arabia. And a lot of that was driven by American and some British, and maybe some others, but those were the two main ones, companies in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so the big American companies were there, and then Saudis created their own company that becomes known as Aramco. It's an acronym. Don't need to know what all that stands for, but Aramco is the Saudi oil company. Now, as oil becomes more important, right, with the explosion of driving of cars, airplanes, etc., right, jet engines, all that stuff in the 50s and 60s, oil becomes much more important. That makes Saudi Arabia more important to the world. And it wasn't just Saudis, but they were one of the big ones, right? Still are. Well, the oil producing nations formed a organization called OPEC. It's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. I think I got that right. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's really all the countries, which were most of the Middle Eastern in this group originally, but not all, got together that make most of their money by exporting oil at the time. I think they organized in the late 50s and 60s and said, we're going to set prices on oil together. Okay, so they create essentially an international cartel. In 1973, OPEC, again, which was dominated by Arab countries and Muslim countries, so it wasn't just Arab, but Muslim primarily too, because Iran was in OPEC for a while. They put an oil embargo on the United States and Europe in 1973, and this was connected to the war going on in Israel, between Israel and Egypt and Syria. We talked about that war, the Yom Kippur War, the October War, okay? And Saudi Arabia and OPEC wanted to use its oil power to put pressure on the United States particularly, but also other European countries, not other. They want to put pressure on the United States and European countries to help Arabs in their struggle with Israel. And I'll pick up with this in the next video.